Thank you. I am honored and humbled to be here. And this fantasy, this was the graphic they sent me. So this is this month's word, and I absolutely love anything having to do with this, so I am thrilled. Before I get into fantasy, this is me. That's my wife who you met, and my daughters Eowyn and Istra, and I just have a great family, and I like pointing that out. And this is my girls. We go to a homeschool co-op once a week, and this is what they decided they needed to wear last time. And yeah, I just love that. And as she was saying, my general what I'm doing now credentials, I do host the Beware of Monsters podcast. It's off of Jeremy Robinson's website, which is Beware of Monsters. We read a book on branding, so there you go. And it's neat because really it's mostly an interview show where I interview creatives who have anything to do with monsters. Like I've talked to comic book illustrators, novelists, filmmakers, all sorts of people. And sometimes then we just get together and do like movie reviews and stuff. And Chesterton Stage Productions, like she was saying, it's a group. I loved hearing like all the stuff about like CreativeMornings manifesto there, because it's very much like community and art, and I want to bring together people who just want to be creative, so it's exciting to be here. And this was last year's production. I did Pooh and then had a photo shoot for Beware of Monsters, and I just felt very schizophrenic in my life, and there you go. That's me. So I'm gonna, and I also taught high school literature for a while, which you're about to notice a lot. So thinking about fantasy, fantasy is kind of all over the place right now, and it's mostly blamed, on Marvel and DC, and then Tolkien a few years ago, like these movies bringing that idea back. But if we go back to literally the oldest literature that we have, it's the Epic of Gilgamesh is where writing begins. And for those of you not familiar, Gilgamesh he's actually called Nimrod in the Bible, which was not an insult until the 50s when people misunderstood Bugs Bunny. Yeah. Anyway, Nimrod, Gilgamesh. He was a great and powerful leader. He started the country of Babylon, and since he was so powerful, wanted to do a couple things. First of all, he was going to make a giant wall to show his glory. And I was really trying to say that as not a reference, but he was going to make a giant wall for his glory. And the other thing he did was he wanted to bless every marriage in his land. So to make sure they started off right, the wife got to be with him first. And the people of Babylon didn't like this. But he held a lot of the cards because he was actually, in the epic, he was from the sun god. He was like 2/3 god, 1/3 man. And so you really couldn't argue with him. So they asked the sun god to send someone else. And the sun god sent Enkidu, who was also superhuman, but he was like this animal human, and the horns aren't actually part of him. He wore this helmet that had horns, and he was a strategist and a fighter, and he shows up, and the two of them, of course, start beating on each other, and they fight on the wall, they fight all over the place, and then Gilgamesh is about to fall off the wall, and Enkidu grabs him and saves him. And as the way these things go, they then become friends because they just beat each other up, and now they're happy. So now this super powerful sun god guy and the animal man are friends, and then the rest of the epic, they actually go on adventures together and they fight different monsters, and you can see why I picked up on this. And this is the very beginning of literature. And then this summer, we spent $9 million to see a sun god man who we feared had too much power. So the animal man, who, by the way, the horns are just affectation, decides he's going to fight him. And then, if you haven't seen it, I don't want to spoil it, but they beat on each other for a while, and then they're friends, and they go on adventures. So fantasy has been something that has existed in humanity for all time and almost unchanged. And so, yes, like, what's the point that, like, the very first, the beginning of literature to last summer's blockbuster? And the first thought, like, has anything changed? Well, their powers have been slightly shuffled and their attitudes a little, but you could say, like, well, now we know they're fictional characters. Like, nobody thinks Superman's real, and now we're doing it, like, we're watching these movies, we spend a ton of money on them, and we make them real and gritty, so it feels... But I think if you look at what was happening with Gilgamesh, I know that, like, there's scholarship and whatever, and I don't think, I'm not trying to disprove anything, but the idea that, like, mythology is just scared, simple people trying to explain what lightning is, like, ooh, I'm scared of that. That must be a big thunder hammer and Thor and all of that. I don't think that explains Gilgamesh, because I actually think, first of all, it was written, and now, if you go home today, sit at your computer, by dinner time, you could be a published author and your mom could have given you 5 stars on Amazon. Like, putting a book out is easy. Writing a book is not easy. Like, well, if you can do it by dinner, great. But the amount of money, effort, man hours that went into Batman v Superman, to put Gilgamesh on tablets, it was a similar endeavor. Like, these things are pushed into clay. It was expensive. It took a lot of people, a lot of smart people, and a lot of creative people. And the other thing about, like, what it was, like, yeah, Gilgamesh probably was a real person, but the story, that's kind of the kickoff of it. It's not like they were confused about who he was. At least this is my reading. They weren't confused about who he was and thought, oh, it's not like Egypt, where the pharaohs were at that point using their mythology as political leverage and saying, like, look, I'm one of the gods that you read about, so you need to listen to me. The epic seems to have come later, and it was more like, we know there was this city, we know there was this guy, so we're going to use the stuff that we know as the jumping off point of our fantasy to make it more real, to make it feel more like it happened in our world, the same way Batman and Superman blow up buildings that look like our real world and we feel like we're there. So with all of this idea of fantasy has been around forever and it's all the same, like, what's the point? Well, actually, both of these, the story ultimately is about what is the meaning of friendship, what is the meaning of valor and morality, and what does death have to do with life, and how does the fact that we are going to die, no matter how strong we are, have to do with how we live life. And so thinking about that in these different mythologies, I then jump over to Greek mythology, which when I'm homeschooling the kids, that we're doing Greek mythology now. So I'm thinking about it almost all the time. And, like, with Greek, there's the myths and then there's Homer. And one of the myths is Hera and Argus. And I was so afraid I was going to say Argus wrong, and I probably did. But Argus, does anybody know do you know who he is?
He's the many-eyed.
Yes! He has 100 eyes, and he's guarding a cow because Zeus was sleeping with some girl he wasn't supposed to be. Hera got mad. Zeus turned her into a cow so Hera wouldn't know. And it's just like all of this, once again, kind of breaks the idea of it's explaining natural phenomena, because it's like, it's a soap opera. And then this 100-eye guy is watching the cow. Hermes kills him to save the cow. But here's the part I think is interesting. When Hera finds her dead friend, she takes the 100 eyes and puts them on the tail of a peacock. So that's why we have the decorations on the peacock. Now, that's not something like, nobody's sitting there going, it's got too many eyes. It's not like thunder and lightning. It's not like the movements of war. It's just, that's a cool idea. And so what I'm thinking is more, the fantasy even then was about studying what life means, like we see in Gilgamesh, and then looking at this world, like our world is literally magical. Like, I heard somebody explaining, like, you think of people trying to move things with their minds. Like, moving my hand is literally moving something with my mind. And then you think about how fascinating it is, like, ooh, look, we made this robot. It can walk across the floor. Like this morning, I had all my chickens out, and they're running around the backyard. I'm like, it's so cool that all these weird little creatures are running around. And to some extent, that's what fantasy does, is it reminds us of how magical the world we live in is. And even when you look at Homer, the Iliad, one of the big mistakes people make about the Iliad, and it's funny, I was just talking to another homeschool dad yesterday who was teaching the Iliad, and the book he got on it, he hadn't read the original, he just read the summary, mentioned how Achilles had been dipped in the river Styx, so is invulnerable except for his heel. Well, this is the thing. When you think about those myths as religion, you'd think you don't want to mess with that. Like, once it's said, it's canon, which is really funny because in the comic book community, everybody has taken a different hack at these characters, but most readers have latched on to one version. So when you try to go away, people freak out. But then the Iliad has Achilles as the main character. The Trojan War was about, 200 to 400 years before Homer and whoever Homer was. And Achilles, that myth had been around for a long time. The Iliad actually throws out the idea that he's invulnerable. There is no reference in that book to him being dipped. There's no reference to him having the powers that him being dipped would have. Just the same way in Batman v Superman, Superman doesn't have freeze breath. That's just ridiculous. We're throwing that out. So, Homer, when writing this, I know it gets, people will simplify it and say it's the Greeks' Bible, but it was different in that Homer, I really think, used artistic license very openly and changed things around and even questioned his entire culture, because the Greek culture, our entire story form, every movie book you read has the same 7-point story arc, unless it's a really terrible kids book, some of those, that comes from the Greeks. And the Greeks were a shame-based society. They believed that your value came from what other people said about you. Where we're an ego-based society, where we try to believe that our value comes from how we feel about it. So if we do something good, but everybody else says we're wrong for doing it, we can feel good about ourselves and know it's right. Where the Greeks, even if they feel bad about themselves, if everybody else is singing your praises, they would say that's right. And that's what the society was based on, that's what their mythology taught, and that's why story was so important to them. But the Iliad literally is arguing the point that that's wrong, or at least wondering if it is, because one of the things, they would get prizes so that there would be a reward, so that people could say, he did this great battle, he got this reward, and they could tell the story. In the very beginning of the Iliad, Achilles has his prize taken away. And he starts to realize, wait a minute, this has no value. I was going to fight this battle, I got this prize, and it was just taken away. So does it matter what other people think about me, or is it should I just do things because I think they're right? So we have this, taking a break. We have, I tend to get really loud when I get excited, so it's a small space. I don't want to. So from the beginning of time, we have fantasy. We have this, I think they're true, but unfortunately, I think there's a scholarly approach to it that kind of blows it off, where it's just explaining ignorant things, or the newer one, it's just for children, where I actually think fantasy isn't really for children because they don't need it. Getting back to this whole magical world, they can see the chicken, and you can invent a flying dragon monster, but they just saw this thing fly over their head and land over there, and that's amazing. Fantasy is really more for us to whom the blade is kind of dulled, and be reminded that this world is magical. G.K. Chesterton wrote a book called Man Alive, and in it, one of the things, the guy one day just announces to his wife and children, that you're a very nice wife and you're very nice children, but I have a better wife and better children somewhere else, and I need to go find them. Goodbye. And he takes his rake and he goes out the door and keeps walking straight until he goes all the way and around the entire world. And then from a distance, he sees this beautiful house that he's been looking for this entire journey. And it's tiny and magical. And when he goes, there's this beautiful woman, and it's all his family and his wife, but he needed the fantasy to remind him of what he knew, but it got dulled from seeing it every day. Luckily, apparently, my wife is a lot hotter than his, because I'm reminded every morning. So I'm not going to take that long walk. But, and then trying to figure this out, I was taking all these ideas and trying to put them into something comprehensive, and I decided I needed to do more research, so I went out to see the movie Doctor Strange. And it was really good. It was Scott Derrickson. I very much enjoy that director. And it's about this guy who, he breaks his hands and becomes a sorcerer. But in it, one of the things, when he's learning his sorcery and fighting through magic and stuff like that, they have this mirror world, which just pretty much because of all the stuff I've seen from this director, and I know he also wrote the script, it's a thing that he kind of plays with a lot. But the mirror world is a fantasy world. It's a fractured version of our own reality, where they go to train and they could fight and it would be safe, and because nothing would break there, but it seemed real for the time you were in it. And it really seemed like that was what fantasy is. It's another place we can go where we can explore ideas, where we can explore feelings, where we can explore just things that may not be safe in our world. J.R.R. Tolkien, who I really like, Éowyn is actually named after a character from Tolkien. Anyway, and Istra is from C.S. Lewis. But when we were having kids, my wife and I were talking about how we wanted to be, a united front, that we didn't want the kids to think that mom and dad were at each other, that we were together. But I did tell her that she is welcome when the kids say, "Why the hell did I get this weird name?" She can say, "It's all your father's fault. Go ahead and ask him." So, So far, they're just annoyed that they introduce themselves and people say, "Oh, nice to meet you, Aaron and Esther." Okay, sorry. Going back to this, Tolkien said, I have a list. Tolkien said that fantasy is the back door to your heart, and you're willing to explore ideas that may not be safe. There's a very scary political climate right now. And if you name the people involved, everybody is going to go into a corner. It's more than two corners, but there's a corner where if we start discussing the Dark Lord Sauron and how he took over Middle-earth and what should be done about that, well then we can actually have a conversation in a mirror world, in the back door, and we can have a safe conversation and find out what's going on. I actually was asked to do another podcast, and I read a comic book, New Gods, number 7, the beginning of the Bloodline trilogy. I wasn't even sure what it is. But at one point, okay, that's not totally true. I'm trying to be cool. I knew it was the beginning of the New Gods. They were invented by Jack Kirby. It has Darkseid in it, who's going to be in the next Batman, Superman movie. And I'm thrilled. Anyway, but at one point they were the head of New Genesis. There's New Genesis and Apocalypse. Those were the two worlds that were fighting. It was very obvious. But the head of New Genesis said, do not swear allegiance to a person this time. Do not swear allegiance to a government or an institution, because things are about to get so mixed up and things are going to become so confusing in this battle that you have to swear your allegiance to your morality and to your ideals and to what you want to come out of this. And it was neat because it was it was inviting you in to decide, what do I believe and what is worth fighting for and how am I going to perceive in life? I'm hiding. That's what I'm doing. Sorry. How I'm going to live my life outside of the corner I've stuck myself in. And that whole phrase, fantasy being the back door to your heart, I heard that. I actually just thought it was kind of a subversive thing. If I had a fantasy book that had an idea that I wanted somebody else to agree with, but they didn't, I could sneak them this, and that would. And I never thought of it as something for me. But a while ago, I was thinking that maybe I shouldn't be pursuing creative stuff as much because it seemed like, for me, it was not working out and maybe it's just a waste of time. And I was asked on this huge project that I was floored. I actually literally went to the interview and suggested other people they should get instead of me. And they're just hey, what would you bring to this? I'm have you met Gloria? She's the one you want. And they hired me anyway. And it was a weird roller coaster because the project came out it's one of the highlights of my life. And it came out fantastic. And afterwards, people were ooh, what are you going to do next with this group? And I was well, they haven't told me anything about that yet, so I don't even know if it will be me next time. And I was just being really modest. It turns out I was totally right. And it wasn't me next time. And after that, through a weird series of events, I ended up selling cameras at Best Buy. And got kind of down on myself. I at one point literally thought this was God telling me that you're really good interpersonally for about half an hour. So this is what you're good for. There you go. Stop trying to do that creative stuff, which actually was kind of a relief when I found that this talk was only 20 minutes. So then after a little while of that and this whole self-pity, and I got a graphic novel that came out in the 80s, which is funny because when I was a little kid, I didn't read a whole lot, and I remember flipping through this and having no idea what it was because it was so strange. But it was Batman, so I wanted to know what it was. And it's if you know comic books, it's kind of trite that this is the turning point comic book for me, but it was called Batman: The Dark Knight Returns. And I'm going to this is really silly. I'm going to try to get through this without being emotional. But here I was. I'm now over 40. I'm a camera salesman and trying to take care of my kids, kind of losing the magic in just that. And it shouldn't be this hard. Okay. And so then I start reading this book just because it's Batman. It's cool. But in this one, Batman's 50. And he's given up on being Batman because what was the use of doing that? There's still crime. And then he starts getting really nervous and realizing he should go back to it. And he's kind of throwing away all the things he's built up in his life. And even if it is just a little bit, he's throwing away what he has to give if he stops doing this now. So he puts the cowl back on. And just in case the symbolism wasn't hitting me enough, he then gets a new Robin who is a girl. He suddenly has who he has to mentor and bring up and train. You know. So my daughters, every once in a while are like, "Hey, Daddy, can you do a play for us so we can be in it?" And like one of the things was, I'm not doing this sort of thing because nobody's giving me the opportunity. So I'm like, well, they want me to do one. So I put a Facebook status update. I'm going to do a play with kids. And you can meet at the library on this day if you're interested. And people showed up. And we ended up renting a school gym, and we did Beauty and the Beast. It was 20 minutes. It went really well. And then at the end, I was like, kind of becoming a little megalomaniac, and I named it. And I'm like, okay, this is now Chesterton Stage Productions, and it's GK Jr. because we're a subset, because I want to leave my options open to do other things. And but it was great. It was a lot of fun, and it was like everybody had different ideas. Like some people stuck with it. Like there are people who are at the first one, and this is the fourth one. Alice will be the fourth one. And there are people who have been in all of them besides my kids. And there are people who are like, I want my child to be well-rounded. They should try theater. Here. They're well-rounded now. But I mean, that's fine. It works well. But it was cool because, like, I wanted a community, and I wanted to be creative, and I wanted to remind myself and others just this world is magical, and I'm getting to do that. And yeah, we did Beauty and the Beast. We did The Light Princess. Last time we did Winnie the Pooh, and the other fun thing is like just watching my kids, because in the first one I have them do auditions. I have all the kids audition, because one of the things is I want it to be as real. Like, I'm not doing a little kid play with training wheels. Like, I am training them. This is the first time they've done it, but it's a real play. It is real. And so I have them audition so we can see, and I try to do it like a real audition so that if they're like, I like this, I want to try another play. Like my daughter Istra, we went to see a play, and afterwards she's like, Daddy, did you direct that? I'm like, no, I didn't. So there are plays you don't direct. yeah, there are. She's like, so then she's like, I would like to be in one of those. Which, they're talking, I believe what she was saying was she wants to be in more plays. Though at that point, like she had been in one at that point, and she refused to audition. She had a non-speaking part, and
she was 5.
She was 5 at this point. Yes. My oldest daughter got sort of a chorus part. She was an animal servant, and my youngest daughter wasn't sure she was going to walk on stage. And I'm standing off to the side watching everything. she holds her sister's hand. She went on stage, walks over to me. Daddy, I'm in the play. I'm doing the play. Like, yes, you still are. And it's cool because they've moved up. Then Éowyn in the next one was a fairy who had her own lines, and Istra was a fairy who went on stage. And then Éowyn in Pooh was Piglet. Oh, it was so good. I have videos of her doing the balloon thing. It's amazing. We had a huge balloon. She jumped on it, had a pin in her hand, and smacked it. So it popped, and she landed, and everybody got scared, and then she did her lines. It was so good. And tomorrow, she's going to be Alice. Istra's the dormouse who sings and stuff. Oh, it's so exciting. Okay, so fantasy. Was I talking about that? Yeah. And that's the thing. I think fantasy is a fabulous thing. I have talked to people who study it scholarly. I've talked to people who write stuff about zombies ripping off guys' arms, and people who write more like space opera things, and all of them are like Jonathan Mayberry, one of the nicest people I've ever spoken to. He writes some of the grisliest stuff, and his fight scenes are the most visceral I've ever, I feel like I'm being punched in the face when I read them. He is the nicest, sweetest guy. And I was interviewing him, and I asked him, where do monsters come from for him? Is there some background? He's like, well, when I was growing up, monsters weren't really what I read about. They were in my family because I was abused. And he was abused growing up, physically beaten, and he learned karate. And at 14, his dad started to beat him. He took him down and then left. And through that, his books, when you read them, there are monsters and scary things, but it's actually about the people who have the strength to not only defeat the monster, but then not become the monster and grow and be positive and be everything everybody's talking about here. And I prefer that. I know there are some things where it's all just dark. Going back to that mirror world in Doctor Strange, he's fighting the bad guys and he brings them into the mirror world so that, good, the fight won't affect anyone. And his partner there, here's some exposition. Actually, if you bring dark forces into the mirror world, it can become even worse. So there is that negative side. If you want to communicate something negative and horrible through fantasy, it still is the back door of the heart. But, yeah, okay. So, in summary, I think fantasy is a fabulous thing. Take a new look at fantasy literature and art, and thus take a new look at your own heart and the world around you. If you have a chance, Beware of Monsters is a podcast where I talk about monsters. And Alice, Through the Looking Glass, will be performing tomorrow. And even if you can't make it, if you could think nice thoughts for us, that would be fantastic. Thank you so much. Thank you.